How do you feel when you give someone advice? Studies say most of us feel great, maybe even a bit empowered. But what about the person listening? For them, advice often comes with some doubt, a hint of judgment, and sometimes a lot of stress. When giving advice, individuals often unintentionally position themselves as superior to the recipient. This dynamic, though often unconscious, can lead to resentment from the person receiving the advice, even when it's well-intentioned. Research, such as the study Advice Giving, A Subtle Pathway to Power, reveals that the desire to feel powerful often motivates advice giving. Simply offering advice can give a sense of importance and a feeling of influence over others, regardless of whether anyone actually follows the suggestions. In fact, recent research shows that the more advice people give, the more powerful they feel. For those who seek influence, giving advice becomes a natural way to fulfill that need. And let's be real, sometimes advice is just a way to show off how smart we think we are, or because we're feeling left out or need to feel important. Occasionally, what's called constructive feedback is really just an excuse to vent or, in some cases, to be hurtful, all while pretending to be helpful. So, it's worth asking, why give this feedback? If it's not genuinely to help someone improve, maybe it's best to hold back. While advice giving may benefit the giver by boosting their sense of influence, the impact on the person receiving the advice can be quite different. Studies show that receiving advice can have a negative impact, making the recipient feel less confident, more judged, and sometimes demotivated, especially when the advice is unsolicited. Giving advice too readily can even hinder the recipient's learning and growth. When someone is handed a solution, they miss out on the process of figuring things out independently, limiting their ability to learn from the experience. This can subtly suggest a lack of confidence in their ability to make decisions alone. Imagine this. A well-meaning coworker steps in to assist with a task that has been in progress, confidently explaining how they would approach it differently and offering step-by-step advice without being asked. They may feel capable, maybe even heroic, for stepping in. On the receiving end, however, it might feel as though they are highlighting unnoticed mistakes, creating pressure, and potentially making the task feel more overwhelming. For those who may be more vulnerable, constantly receiving advice can subtly reinforce a belief that they need someone else's opinion for security or approval. Over time, this erodes trust in their own judgment and strengthens the feeling that they can't make decisions without outside input. Most advice isn't asked for. Often, it arrives unprompted, without considering that the other person didn't invite any judgment, correction, or direction. When advice is dropped on someone unexpectedly, there's little chance they'll be in the right mindset to really hear it. There are plenty of ways to give feedback, and advice often just puts people on the defensive, comes across as a bit arrogant, or feels more like a suggestion than genuine help. While constructive feedback can inspire people to go from good to great, advice often falls flat. Studies show that unsolicited advice often gets ignored, and worse, can be seen as manipulative, as if the advice giver is flaunting knowledge or trying to show off. This perception makes the advice feel less useful, less motivating, and more likely to create resistance or defensiveness than genuine openness to change. Unsolicited advice frequently leads to pushback, with recipients quick to point out areas where the advice giver could improve too. Even when offered with good intentions, unsolicited advice rarely convinces those on the receiving end. They're likely thinking, who are they to give advice? Maybe they should focus on their own issues first. Other research shows that receiving unsolicited advice can even cause physical stress. So while we might think we're helping, advice, especially when unasked for, can actually do more harm than good. On the flip side, when someone asks for advice, they're more likely to see it as helpful. But even then, it's wise to tread lightly. Asking for advice can still lead to mixed feelings, especially if it comes across as too forceful or judgmental. Giving advice is essentially telling someone else what to do, as if we've got all the answers on what will work and what won't. But how could any of us truly know? Most of the time, we're missing background information, and it's hard to fully understand the other person's emotions and motivations. On top of that, advice often reflects our personal biases and may not be the best solution for the other person. Since there isn't always one right answer to a problem, the best approach can vary widely based on individual values and circumstances. Offering advice might even limit the recipient's perspective, possibly hiding other solutions that could be more helpful. By sharing our viewpoint, we might unintentionally steer them away from exploring other good options they haven't considered yet. And what works for us doesn't necessarily work for everyone else. Each person has their own goals, situations, and unique challenges that we, as outsiders, can't fully grasp. The advice we give may even reflect what we ourselves need to hear more than what suits the other person. And let's be honest, sometimes even our own tried and true methods need a refresh as our lives and situations evolve. What worked wonders for us once might not hold the same value now. Giving advice often leaves the other person with just two options: take it or ignore it, and each option comes with its own challenges. If they take our advice, they're essentially admitting we were right and they were wrong, which might feel good to us but can easily create defensiveness. On the other hand, if they choose to ignore the advice, it opens the door for an "I told you so" moment later on. Even if we never actually say it, they might worry we're disappointed or even a bit insulted. Either way, this can create a wall of defensiveness, blocking any real openness to future feedback. When someone asks us for advice, it's often because they believe we might know better. And sometimes, that's genuinely the case. Think about it. If you're not a mechanic, you rely on one to keep your car running safely. Or when a health issue comes up, you trust a doctor's expertise. In situations where we're too close to see clearly, an outsider's perspective, like a friend with fresh eyes, can be really helpful. But giving advice doesn't mean it's automatically the right solution, nor does it mean they're putting us in charge of their choices. There's also a basic disconnect in how advice is seen by the person giving it and the person receiving it. The one giving advice often feels they're helping by narrowing down options, while the one receiving it usually just wants to gather more information. This difference can lead to misunderstandings, with the advice giver feeling a bit upset if their input isn't taken seriously and the other person feeling surprised by the reaction. When advice comes across as if it's the only right answer, it can lead to pushback, half-hearted agreement, or even just tuning it out. So, if you notice people frequently following your advice, it might actually hint at an uneven power dynamic rather than real trust in your insights. Research backs up the idea that ignoring advice can create some pretty tricky social dynamics. A study titled "Seeker Beware" found that when people feel their advice is ignored, they often take it personally. This is especially true if the person giving advice is an expert in that area. They may feel offended or even disrespected. And it's not uncommon for them to distance themselves from the person who didn't follow their suggestion. In some cases, they might decide not to offer advice again, or, if the disappointment is strong enough, even let go of the relationship altogether. When advice isn't followed, it can also affect how the person giving advice views the other. They might start seeing them as less competent, careless, or not taking things seriously. This shift in perception can hurt the advice seeker's reputation, and in turn, make it harder for them to get support in the future. And if the person asking for advice tends to consult multiple people, the one giving advice may feel that their input doesn't hold much value. All this can create a bit of tension, especially if the advice giver starts to feel like their perspective is being devalued or overlooked. So, should we stop giving advice altogether? Not necessarily. Advice has its place, but it shouldn't be the first tool we reach for when we want to support someone. And like any tool, it works best when used sparingly and thoughtfully, almost as a last resort. Think of advice as something delicate. It should be handled with care. So, before sharing that well-meaning advice, here are a few points to reflect on. People find lasting solutions when they create them. When people come up with their own solutions, those solutions carry a lot more meaning and are far more likely to lead to action than advice from someone else ever could. Sometimes, the most helpful thing we can do is simply to listen, showing them that we trust their ability to figure it out in their own way. By creating a space where they feel free to express themselves without judgment, we give them the chance to unload what's on their mind and arrive at their own conclusions. In these moments, offering support is less about advising and more about empowering them to find answers that align with their unique needs. Support often means listening, not advising. One of the best ways to support someone is by asking open-ended questions. Simple questions like, "How have you handled this so far?" Or, "What's been working for you?" can help them think through their own solutions instead of feeling like they're being told what to do. This makes it more of a two-way conversation, where you're both exploring the issue together, rather than a one-sided lecture. Often when people ask, "What should I do?" they really just want to work things out for themselves, not have an answer handed to them. You might even repeat back what you've heard to make sure you're on the same page by asking, "Did I get that right?" This small act of listening and checking in can make a huge difference in helping them find their own answers. Honor their experience. When offering support, it helps to remember that someone else's experiences, background, and goals are probably different from our own. What worked for us might not work for them. So it's best not to assume that our own life lessons will always apply. We can recognize their strengths and past successes by asking how they've handled similar situations. This approach shows respect for their abilities and reinforces that they're capable of handling things on their own. It's about honoring their journey and helping them take the next steps in a way that feels right for them. Check if they even want advice. Before jumping in with advice, it helps to check if the person actually wants it. A simple question like, "Are you looking for advice?" or just thinking things through, shows that you're meeting them where they are. Sometimes people just need someone to listen as they sort out their thoughts, and asking first demonstrates respect for their needs at that moment. It's a small step, but it can make all the difference in creating a supportive space. Trust their intuition. Oftentimes, people already know the answer. They just need someone to listen as they work through it. Encourage them to trust their gut by asking, "What does your intuition say?" or "What feels right to you?" This reminds them that they already have helpful answers within themselves. By supporting their instincts, you're helping them build confidence in their own judgment rather than making them rely on outside opinions. Be mindful of your intentions. Finally, it's important to check in with yourself. This means letting go of any attachment to how things turn out or to being right when giving advice. When you offer advice without pressure, it feels genuine and caring, not self-serving. Remember, their priorities might be different from yours, and that's okay. Their choices don't need to reflect your own values or decisions. By approaching them with acceptance, you create a space where they feel free to make their own choices. Knowing your support comes from respect for who they are, without any expectations. Now, think about your own experiences with advice. Who has made you feel genuinely understood and confident? Who took the time to see things from your perspective before offering suggestions? Reflecting on these moments can guide us in how we show up for others, creating the kind of support that truly empowers